Reed, who is not a graduating student, but has still spent a lot of time and energy into these presentations. Can we give him a round? I also want to thank the Professors Rosengartner and Lindner, who led our class through this process of thesis writing. I want to thank Dean Culp of the Disciples Divinity School, who is also here, who I think she'll recognize, she was not my advisor, but I think she'll recognize some influences from a class that she taught and some conversations that we had together in this presentation. And most importantly, my advisor, Professor Hopkins, who is also here, who was with me through this process and sat with me as I tried to figure out how to make my stories make sense theologically in an academic paper, which was a lot of work for me. But they'll be restorified for you tonight. And then also my mother is here. She drove all the way from the suburbs of Detroit, which incidentally is where my presentation begins. So this is Detroit, and you can see Detroit, no, that's Bloomfield Hills. You can see Detroit is this yellow area here. This is Metro Detroit. And I grew up here, about 20 minutes north of the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit has these grid lines that go up from the river here. And this grid line is 8 Mile Road, and I grew up around 20 Mile Road up here, in a suburb called Bloomfield Hills. Now, Bloomfield Hills is a very wealthy suburb of Detroit, as you can see from this black and gold sign here. Now, all the signs in Bloomfield Hills are in black and gold. The street signs are in black and gold. The signs on the businesses are in black and gold. Like Chase Bank doesn't have a blue logo in Bloomfield Hills. It has to have a black and gold logo. I was a youth group director for a church in Bloomfield Hills, and we had car washes, as you do with youth groups, to fundraise, and we had to make black and gold signs to put on the street to advertise, or else we would get a fine from the city. So they take their black and gold very, very seriously in Bloomfield Hills. Some other aspects of Bloomfield Hills that make it unique is there are no sidewalks in Bloomfield Hills. People don't walk the streets in Bloomfield Hills, and if they do, they're walking streets that are wide enough for both cars and people. There are no public parks in Bloomfield Hills. We don't want the riffraff from the surrounding suburbs over here. They're not quite as wealthy in those suburbs, and we don't want them in Bloomfield Hills. Plus, everyone in Bloomfield Hills, almost everyone that matters, goes to country clubs. Within 3 miles of my home, there were 3 different country clubs. So we didn't go to Detroit. We talked about the fact that we didn't even go out of Bloomfield Hills very often. We lived in the Bloomfield Hills bubble, and we would not go south of 16 Mile or 8 Mile. I remember talking to some of these girls in this youth group that I went to. They had gone to a concert in Detroit, and on their way to the concert, they realized they were low on gas, and they had to pull off in Detroit in order to get gas. And as they were relaying this story to me, they were like in sort of laughter, tears, still afraid from this experience where they had to pull off the highway and go to get gas in this strange community. What we know about Detroit as Bloomfield Hills teenagers is that there's a lot of crime there. We know that there's a lot of poor people in Detroit, and that everyone there looks different from us. Over 70% of the people in Oakland County, which is the county just north of Detroit, are white, and over 80% of the people in Detroit are black, as of the 2010 census. So that is actually very true. You would stick out in either place if you were not the right race. Also, the perception that the city of Detroit is much less wealthy than Bloomfield Hills is correct. the average income of somebody in Detroit is only 40% of the average income of somebody in Bloomfield Hills. And, so there's Bloomfield Hills again. And in Detroit, over the last 60 years, there's been a huge population decrease in Detroit at the pinnacle of its population sort of boom in the 1940s and 50s. There was about 2.1 million people who lived there. Now there's under 700,000. Less than 50% of the businesses and homes are occupied. And so you have streets that look a little bit like this one, where all the businesses are boarded up and closed. And so it's a little bit of a hyperbole, actually, in terms of how wealthy the community I grew up in is compared to how poor the community of Detroit is. And that reminds me of a scripture passage, which makes this relevant to ministry. So here is an artistic rendition of a parable from the 16th chapter of Luke of the rich man and Lazarus. So you can see the story begins with the rich man who has a lot to eat and is attired beautifully, very reminiscent of my fellow suburbanites. And outside of his gate is the poor man, Lazarus. He is begging for food, but ignored by the rich man. And you can't see it very well here, it's too dark, but there are some dogs that are licking at some wounds on his hand. So this is another hyperbole of the rich and the poor. So both men die, and the rich man goes to the fiery pits of hell, and you can see he's very, very thirsty. And then the poor man gets taken up to be with Abraham, and he lays in the bosom of Abraham, the most beloved place in heaven. And they can see each other after they've died. And so the rich man calls out to Abraham, and he says, please send down Lazarus to give me a drink of water. And Abraham tells him that there is a chasm between the two of them, an unbridgeable chasm between the two of them. So the rich man starts thinking about his friends and his family that are still alive, and he says, well, will you send Lazarus back from the dead to warn my friends and family who are still alive? And Abraham says, no, they have the prophets. And the prophets would alert them to this injustice that's happening in the way that it affects them at an existential level. So that's the end of the parable. So this is a story about people, but it is also a story about places. So in life, between the rich man and Lazarus is this gate. And between the rich man's brothers and family that are still alive is also this gate. And in death, that gate becomes an unbridgeable chasm. Now, the prophets also talk about a gate. They talk about a gate at the city gate in the ancient Near East, in front of cities. That's where the elders would gather and sort of distribute justice. And often the justice that the prophets talk about being distributed at the gate is a justice that brings liberation to the poor and to the oppressed. And so this gate here, I say, needs to be transformed from this gate that keeps the two communities separate into a gate where justice can happen, particularly justice that is liberation for the poor and the oppressed. So when I think about Detroit, I want to think about the place of Detroit and the place where that gate may be. Now, what do I mean when I say place? So, place, this is the example I'm going to give. I'm going to talk about what I mean when I say place and give you the example of how this is the place. So, when I say place, place has a lot of different layers. It has a layer that is the materiality of the place. It has a layer that is the feelings that are connected to the place. It has the history of the place. the stories we tell about the place, and from all of those aspects of place, we can think about the values that that place then has and perpetuates, the values that created it and the values that it continues to perpetuate in the world. So this place is the Joe Louis Fist. It is, let's see, so this is Detroit. The Joe Louis Fist, actually it was dedicated on my birthday, October 16th, 1986. Right here, where everything comes together in the center of the city of Detroit. It was commissioned by Detroit's, and actually the nation's, I think, first African-American mayor, Coleman Young. So the history of it is that it was put in this place by a mayor and a city council that was African-American, and they had been sort of left this city and taken power and control of it, and for them it was a symbol of that power that they had. Now, for the people in the suburbs, this has a very different narrative and a very different feeling. So the way that the people in the suburbs, so the values that they see in this fist are that it symbolizes the aggression of the African American community in Detroit, and then it perpetuates and sort of instantiates some of the socioeconomic disparities between the two communities. And then, like I said, it's a symbol of pride for the African American community in Detroit. Now, and the thing about place is that we create places. So we built this place, we put the money down for it, we chose where it went. But places also shape us. So these values of place also affect us. It's more difficult to see that with a piece of artwork, but you can see how the way that your chairs, for example, are facing then also determines sort of how you are facing. So the way that place affects us is pretty straightforward. And because we can affect place and place can affect us, that is why it's the centerpiece of my thesis here, because I think there's something hopeful about that. So by looking at the place, the gate, the connector between the city and the suburbs, we can evaluate the values of that place. We can hold them up against our own values, and then try to do what we can to change that place to better reflect our values, and then hopefully that those new values can trickle out into the larger system. So that's the hope of evaluating a place theologically. So the place that connects the city and the suburbs of Detroit, the gate, in a very real way, is the highways, the commuter highways. They connect the city and the suburbs. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the materiality, the history, some of these different aspects, and how those reflect a certain set of values. So the particular highway is the highway that I'm going to talk about, is the one that I commuted on the most. So this is where I grew up in Bloomfield Hills, and I could hop right down on I-75 and drive to Detroit, where I worked for 3 years. I worked for 2 of those years in a community right over here in southwest Detroit. So here is a picture of that highway you can see. So in Bloomfield Hills, the highway, you can see, when you're in the highway, you can't, this is a picture closer to Detroit, but you can see the homes and you can see sort of some woods that come up around it. But as you get closer to the city, these grassy berms rise up around the highway. And so you can't really see the communities that you're going around. All you can see are these grassy berms. You can see the beautiful cityscape, though. So this is a picture of the community where I worked. So I actually went to this community very often growing up. This restaurant right here is one of my family's favorite restaurants. We probably went there 2 times a year. It's a Mexican restaurant. We could drive right down on I-75 and get right off and park. We literally, you can pull off of the highway and into the parking lot for this restaurant. And so we went to this restaurant very often, and I didn't know until I drove into that community as a worker, but actually it's in the middle of a Mexican-American community right in Detroit. I didn't even know that there was a Mexican-American community in Detroit, but I had been going to this place my whole life, and I was working now less than a mile from it, and in a community that I did not know existed. So this is the highway that's actually right there in near that Mexican town. The exit for it is right here. But these are actually 3 highways, as you can see, that come together. This is the bridge to Canada, and it's kind of magnificent, this picture of the highways. It's a sort of architectural, civic sort of masterpiece. I think in Detroit, one of the things about the highways, we're very proud of the highways. Detroit is the city of the car and the automobile industry, and there's not a lot of public transit, but there is a lot of pride in our cars. So this picture, I think, really well shows that. Well, we're going to return to it in a little bit. So what are the values of the highway as I have described it? I think the value of the commuter highway is pretty clear. There's one very clear value, and that is individual agency. You're trying to get from one place to another place as quickly as possible with as few obstructions as possible. Anything or anyone that gets in your way is a problem. This counts other cars that are driving too slowly, any sort of traffic, any accidents, any police, any sort of construction. All of these are negatives. If you were driving somewhere and someone said, "How was your drive?" and if any of those things got in your way, that would be a bad drive. Those things are bads. The good is getting from one place to another as quickly as possible and with as few sort of interruptions. So, what's the sort of, that's the individual value, but what's sort of the systemic values that are in place here? So we're back to this picture of the highway in southwest Detroit. So the highways in Detroit, as I said, it's a car city. The highways in Detroit were put in place very clearly to allow white flight. Now Detroit is, I think often when I've heard about and read about the white flight broadly throughout all communities, a lot of times it's described as sort of this pastoral dream. People wanted to leave the crowded city and get out to a place where they had a yard, where they had a driveway, a garage. The thing about Detroit is that I think it's close to 60 or 70% of the housing in Detroit is single-family housing with yards, with driveways. This place was built for people with cars. The entire city, the population growth was in the 30s and 40s after the automobile boom had happened. People were not leaving the city in order to have a car and a driveway. They already had cars and driveways in the city. They were leaving because of all the things that were happening with blockbusting and with sort of the racial tensions that were happening in the community. So where were these highways put? So whose personal agency was valued here? So these highways were laid down through the poorest neighborhoods in Detroit. And when you read the transcripts of some of these meetings where the decisions were made, where do we put the highway, that decision is very clear. It is not often because it's the most convenient place to put it or the fastest way of going. It's partly to raise some of these neighborhoods. The idea was that if we lay these highways down where these poor communities are and we sort of dislocate these poor people, then they will, that blighted area will disappear. I don't know what they thought was going to happen to the people who lived there, but this was very, very purposeful. This highway, for example, so it goes through southwest Detroit, and it was laid down right through a neighborhood. So the neighborhood that's on this side and the neighborhood that's on this side of it used to be all one neighborhood, and this goes right down the center of it. And sort of to appease the community, they built this footbridge, which you can see nobody is using that footbridge. Nobody uses that footbridge. It just cut the community right in two. So what are my values and what do they have to say, the Christian values as I understand them, and what do they have to say to these values of the highway? So particularly I want to lift up Martin Buber. And so Buber has these two constructions of how we can relate to others in our world. We can relate to them as it, as objects, the I-it relationship, and or we can relate to them as thous, the I-thou relationship. Now, when we relate to the other as an it, we're relating it to the other as an extension of ourselves. We're trying to use it, or control it, or consume it. When we relate to the other as a thou, we're relating to the other as wholly other and separate from ourselves, as a subject in and of itself. So as you can see, when we individually go on the highway, we're relating to these other cars, these other people in the cars, as it's, right? So they are people to be controlled or gotten around in some way. They're not subjects in and of themselves. Now, the other thing that is happening here, I think, in this lifting up of individual agency is that we're putting ourselves and our own needs at the center. So all the decisions about what is good and what is bad come from ourselves as the center. And so Niebuhr says that this is the primary way of temptation to sin, is to put ourselves as sort of the ultimate arbiters of what is good and what is bad in the world. And so this is something that the highway definitely tempts us to do. And one of the things that Niebuhr talks about is that even though we won't necessarily see the effects of that play out in our own lives, that does affect the world, and it affects the world so as to create these systems of injustice and uphold these systems of injustice, which brings us back to the Bible story, to the gate. It reminds us that the justice at the gate, the liberation of the oppressed, is not happening this highway. So I think in doing all this work in my thesis, I wasn't able to transform this gate into a gate of justice. I tried at it in the longer paper, which my professor will have no doubt read, but I don't think I did a very good job of it. But what I do think I did was create a gate, the highway as a gate of judgment, and discern what the problems are, and use the gate as a way to call out the ways that these systems are oppressing people and building disconnection.